So Marc, ESI and Orchard have just launched a partnership in sustainability comms. I thought it'd be a good opportunity to have a quick chat around what that means for businesses. And I think from our point of view, we hear a lot from consumers and consumer reports around how much they value sustainability. Is that something that you think businesses should be more aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. There are multiple drivers now, meaning that businesses need to take account of sustainability, particularly environmental sustainability. I think that one of the big changing points was when Marc was head of the Bank of England and started being very clear that businesses that don't take account of climate change will go bankrupt without doubt. It was a real threshold moment where someone, particularly around financial services, was saying, look, this doesn't just apply to manufacturers and oil companies. This is something that affects everybody. Since then we've seen increased regulation. So in the UK, listed businesses already have to publicly disclose carbon footprints. That applies to the private businesses, large private businesses. We expect to see that be more widespread. The UK is now talking about imposing reporting to the TCFD standard on listed companies as well. So the direction that it's going from a governance or a law perspective, it's only increasing. Then the backdrop to that is you've got the every economy in the world is pinning its post-COVID hopes on a green revolution and a green economy. So that's massively powerful. You've got COP26 coming this year. You've had the EU have done their own ESG taxonomy. They've launched something called SFDR, which relates to the fund industry. The pressure is massive, and that's, I think, being matched by consumers and perhaps even more so by other businesses. Businesses are much more likely now to say, well, yeah, we'll do business with you if or but, tell us about your sustainability, tell us about your ESG policy, give us some sort of evidence. So, I think over the next 3 years, it's going to define, businesses, and there are so many drivers as to why businesses should do it. We can talk about some of those drivers. It's not all about image, and because we're expected to do it, we should do it. Clearly, there's the existential crisis that we're all trying to tackle, but there are we can talk about clear advantages for businesses that act appropriately, and communications is absolutely key to that. Doing the right communications, avoiding greenwash. Lots of potential, lots of reasons to be doing this.
And if a business were to be thinking about how to become more sustainable or to take it more seriously, what would a good first step be?
You can't manage what you can't measure. So let's measure what you're in today. So it's measure, minimization. So once you know where you stand, how can you actively minimize? Management would be the third stage. So you've measured, you've minimized, how can we continue to find incremental improvement? And benchmarking is really useful. So when you know what your impact is, your emissions footprint, for example, compare it to other businesses. And then lastly, I think, to be really credible, you need an ambition of disclosure. You need to be, in a position where you say, well, by whatever date it is, we're going to disclose, we're going to go public, and we're going to say, our average carbon footprint per employee, is 1.5 tons per employee per year, or 2 tons, or whatever it is, and and that's 200 kilos better than it was last year, and this is where we're going to be next year. I think, saying it's one thing, but it's all about the data and being transparent about performance. But you need a framework, and obviously that's where ESI Monitor come in. We have developed a framework that takes businesses on a guided journey from start point to continued kind of hand-holding and guidance to becoming sustainable, that measures, that manages, that minimises, that benchmarks, that provides the footprinting and the guidance. And it's something that a business can do to itself. at its own pace, utilising its own people. It doesn't need to bring in expensive consultants, and it's all digital, so it's very approachable and it's backed up by our experts.
The ESI framework can help companies measure sustainability and benchmark it. What are the kind of things that it measures? What are the kind of things that it benchmarks in order to help people get that insight into their operational activities, but also into their supply chain?
Yeah, so internationally, all emissions are key. Carbon emissions, when we talk about the existential crisis and climate change, emissions are major. So, one of the keys is, let's measure the emissions. Internationally, all emissions are categorised as something called either Scope 1, Scope 2 or Scope 3 emissions. There's a whole question of, what are you measuring? And incidentally, when companies talk about net neutrality and net zero, they're generally talking about Scope 1 and 2, which is direct and indirect third-party emissions. So Scope 2 typically might be your electricity bill for your premises, and Scope 1 may be the fuel that you burn in central heating or your fleet or your vehicles, etc., etc. Pretty much everything else comes in Scope 3. So when people talk about net neutrality, they're generally talking about Scope 1 and 2, when actually the bulk of their emissions can be in Scope 3. So it's important to understand, where your emissions come from, and then start drilling down on things that you can do to address those emissions.
That definitely sets out a kind of quite clear pathway for people to do sustainability right. What are the kind of things that you might be seeing where businesses are doing it wrong?
Well, the worst case scenario, we talk about greenwash, but the worst, I guess the worst thing is do nothing. Almost as bad as doing nothing is some kind of measurement and offsetting, which we call pay to pollute. It's absolutely vital that minimisation has to be part of your sustainability strategy. If you're claiming or pushing for a net zero and it's just through offsetting, you're really not part of the solution. So in terms of what they're doing wrong, that comes back to the communication again. If they want to talk about what they're doing, whether it's through their website, whether it's through communications, whether it's to stakeholders or staff, they need to be provide some data about when we talk about net neutrality, or we say that we care about the environment, give us some evidence, put some numbers against that. So I think that's the first thing, that everyone's trying to create this green wash, if you like, and different intensities of green, and to an extent there's nothing wrong with that, but sooner or later you've got to back it up with facts. And so then it goes back to the measurement piece. I always go back to, you can't manage what you can't measure. So it's it starts off, where do we stand today? What's our footprint? What's the volume of waste that we're putting into to landfill or whatever it is? What's the impact of our supply chain? Because once you understand that, you can start working through it and say, right, how do we solve this? How do we solve that? How do we reduce that? And it's not something you'll do in a year. It's it might be a 20-year journey.
And so let's take communication as a specific point then. I think what we've said is some ways of good communication around sustainability would be around including data, including that measurement, being really sort of open and honest about what you're measuring and how. But then is it also a case that actually talking about the things that you don't have perfect yet but are working on, is that the right thing to be talking about?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fine. As lovely as it would be, no one expects businesses to be net neutral tomorrow. We've seen a lot of 2030 commitments, and and that's really difficult. So yeah, absolutely be open and say, well, look, this is our footprint, this is our Scope 1 emissions, this is our Scope 2, this is what we measure in Scope 3, this is where we are. You're being in Guernsey, you know what, you're probably going to have a good footprint. We deal with people internationally as well, so where they get their energy from can vary. But generally, Guernsey companies are going to have a pretty respectable footprint. And once they know what that is and the benchmarking's taken place, they may choose to disclose it, and communicate. But communicate the minimisation that they've done. So what minimisation work have they done? What are they planning? Where are they going to be next year or the year after? They're looking for a 10% reduction. How does that compare? That's the things that consumers, that I want to know. And if people are talking about offsetting, well, I want to know how much they've offset, how long is it going to take for those emissions to be sequestered? And I'm not advocating, massive amount of data, but there are a few core things that can really add credibility to sustainability statements and reporting that we see go out every day that that make us cringe.
If a business is looking to improve its data and to make some of those differences to reduce its carbon footprint, what are some of the key opportunities or some of the biggest impact things that they might be able to do in the next few years?
Okay, so there is low-hanging fruit. Early reductions will be easier to achieve, and they may. And for businesses in Guernsey, they've just had the advantage that Guernsey Electricity's now most of the supply comes from sustainable sources in France, and that means that the carbon emissions in local electricity is massively reduced compared to previous years. So they're already seeing that kind of benefit. So there are some early wins for them. But what we start focusing on is businesses can do do this work and play their part in the global community, but they can do it in such a way as there are advantages to them. So they may reduce their running costs by creating efficiencies, but more importantly, the knowledge transfer that takes place in acting sustainably and working with businesses like ours, we start looking for opportunities for them to develop new products. So if we talk about financial services as an example, and it's not exclusive to financial services industries, but they are developing new products and new chargeable sources of revenue that they couldn't do otherwise. And I guess the investment industry is a good example. So the investment industry, they're all selling green portfolios and green investments, and I often ask myself, but what about the guy that's selling me this? What about the operation that's selling me? How sustainable are they? Is it putting the bull in charge of the china shop? Are they acting sustainably as well? So they can be more aligned. If they're acting sustainable themselves, and they're walking the talk or eating their own dog food, as people often say. There's been more. Everyone understands that it's a multi-trillion-pound opportunity, but in the longer term, you'll have to be ethical and transparent to maintain and get a piece of that revenue. But going back to those new opportunities, in the family office space, it could be developing tools to monitor the behaviour and the emissions of your high net worth individuals, and maybe offsetting that for them as a service, a new billable service. It might be administrating offsetting projects on behalf, so literally buying an area of land and foresting it, on behalf of that client. Those clients' lives that they're often super polluters. They're going to come under scrutiny in the future. So how can you help them and kind of manage that? Then there's the whole kind of trustee area, which is about investments and advice and the ESG potential in those investments. We're doing similar things with the fund industry, with banking. There's things like green loans and green linked loans, but all of these new opportunities ring hollow if the organisation themselves don't have the credentials. If they're not walking the walk, they're just selling it and banking it and acting sustainably. And that's again where the communications comes in. It's going to be more and more important, not just what you say, but how you say it, because we're going to see an increase in kind of keyboard warriors and people being taken into account, particularly as we see legislation coming into place in other areas that may not apply here.